The alarms went off before I even had my boots on. I am Ethan Marsh, and 3 years ago I was teaching flight mechanics to bored teenagers at a small academy outside Denver. Now I was running across a tarmac at 2 in the morning, while the sky itself seemed to bend, folding in on a point of light that should not have existed. The light grew. It split into hundreds of smaller lights, then thousands. Each one was a ship. Each one was bigger than anything humanity had ever built. "Marsh, cockpit, now," my commanding officer shouted through the comm in my ear. His name was Oliver Grant, and I had never heard him sound afraid before. He sounded afraid now. I climbed into my fighter, an aging interceptor we called the Hawk, and ran through the start sequence with hands that would not stop shaking. Around me, dozens of other pilots were doing the same. None of us had trained for this. Nobody trains for the sky turning into a wall of alien steel. The transmission came through every channel on the planet at once. Every radio, every television, every phone. A voice, translated into perfect, cold English, filled my helmet. "People of Earth, we are the Kael'th Dominion. Your world has been surveyed, catalogued, and found suitable for integration. Resistance will not be tolerated. You have 1 hour to stand down your defenses and prepare for peaceful transition of your species into our order. This is not a request. 1 hour." I sat in my cockpit, engines humming, and looked up through the canopy at a sky that no longer belonged to us, or so they thought. "Command, this is Marsh," I said. "What are we doing? What's the plan?" There was a pause, too long a pause. "Hold position," Grant said. "Hold position and wait for orders." That was strange. Grant was not a man who waited. I had flown with him for 2 years. He was the kind of officer who moved first and asked questions never. But now his voice was calm, almost too calm, like a man reciting lines he had rehearsed 100 times before. I looked at the radar. The alien fleet was not moving closer. They were holding position too, spread out in a loose formation above the eastern seaboard, the Pacific, and parts of Europe, waiting for our answer. 40 minutes passed. The base around me was quiet, too quiet. I expected shouting, chaos, people running for shelters. Instead, I saw ground crews moving with strange purpose, like ants following a pattern only they understood. Trucks I did not recognize rolled out of hangars I did not know existed. Some of them looked decades old in design. Others looked like nothing I had ever seen in my life, sleek and dark, humming with a soft blue light along their edges. "Sir," I said again, "what is going on down there?" Grant's voice came back, quieter this time. "Ethan, do you trust me?" I did. I always had. "Then trust me now. Whatever happens in the next hour, do not break formation. Do not fire unless I give the order, and do not be afraid." I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to ask why he sounded like a man who already knew how this would end. But the countdown in the corner of my display was ticking toward 0, and the voice from the alien fleet returned. 30 seconds remain. Choose wisely. I thought about my sister in Chicago. I thought about my mother, who still called me every Sunday to ask if I was eating enough vegetables. I thought about how strange it was that the end of the world could feel this quiet, this orderly, like everyone already knew the ending to a story I had not been told. 10 seconds. 5. The countdown reached 0, and nothing happened. No missiles, no fire from the ground, no surrender either. For a long moment, the alien fleet simply hung there in the sky, silent, waiting. Then a single voice crackled through my comm, not from command, but from the open channel, a voice I did not recognize. A woman's voice, calm and clear, speaking slowly as if she wanted to be understood perfectly. "This is Earth. Your survey was incomplete." That was all. 4 words. And then the channel went dead. I sat there in my cockpit, watching the alien fleet above us, waiting for the first shot, the first sign of the invasion beginning. Instead, something strange happened. Small probes detached from several of the larger alien vessels and began descending through the atmosphere, gliding down over major cities, scanning, recording, searching for something. They were not attacking, they were looking for the armies they expected to see, looking for the weapons, the defenses, the desperate final stand of a dying species. They found farmland, quiet streets, empty parking lots, lights turned off in office buildings as if for a normal night. From orbit, Earth must have looked like a world that had simply gone to sleep. That unsettled them more than any weapon could have. I learned later, much later, that the aliens had studied us for nearly 40 years before that night. They had listened to our broadcasts, watched our wars, read our history. They had built a picture of humanity as a fractured, short-lived species, prone to arguing among ourselves, easily divided, and only capable of small, local conflicts. Their reports called us primitive, but promising, worth harvesting for resources and labor, not worth fearing. They were not wrong about our history. They were wrong about what that history had made us. Grant's voice returned to my calm, steady now, almost gentle. Ethan, power down your weapons systems. Return to base. This part is not for pilots. Sir, with respect, what part is this? There was a pause, and when he spoke again, I heard something in his voice I had never heard before. Pride, mixed with something like sorrow. The part where they find out what 100,000 years of surviving everything this planet threw at us actually built. Come home, Ethan. Let the ones who trained for tonight do their work. I did not understand what he meant. Not yet. I brought the Hawk down through clear night air, landed on the tarmac, and climbed out to find the base nearly empty. The trucks I had seen earlier were gone. The strange dark vehicles with the blue light had vanished into tunnels I never knew existed beneath the base. Tunnels that led, I would later learn, to facilities built decades before the first alien ship ever appeared in our sky. Above me, the alien fleet continued its careful, patient scan of a planet that refused to behave the way their reports said it should. I stood on that empty tarmac, looking up at ships large enough to blot out entire constellations, and I felt something strange settle over me. Not fear, not exactly hope either, something quieter, the feeling of a door opening onto a room I had always lived beside, but never been allowed to enter. Grant found me there an hour later, still staring at the sky. They think this is the beginning, he said, standing beside me, his hands in his pockets, watching the same lights I was watching. Isn't it? He shook his head slowly. No, Ethan, this is just the part where they finally ask the right question. The one nobody bothered asking before they decided to come here. What question is that? Grant looked at me, and for the first time that night, he almost smiled. What exactly survived on this planet long enough to build cities out of caves? What kept surviving through ice, through fire, through every disaster this world could throw at it, for longer than their entire species has existed? They came expecting a lamb. Ethan, we have never, not once, been a lamb. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. Across the planet, in bunkers and quiet rooms and places most people had never heard of, humanity prepared to answer a question the Kael'th Dominion did not yet know they had asked, while their probes drifted silently over our sleeping cities, gathering data that would never explain what was coming. Above us, their fleet waited, patient and confident, utterly unaware that the true survey of Earth had not yet begun. 3 days after the ultimatum expired, the Kael'th Dominion began landing troops outside Denver, believing the region held one of our larger military installations. They expected the operation to take an afternoon. I was still grounded, ordered to stay near base while Grant coordinated with people I had never met before, officials who arrived in unmarked cars and disappeared into rooms with no windows. Nobody explained anything to me. I only knew what I saw, and what I saw from the ridge above the valley was something no briefing could have prepared me for. Their landing craft came down in a wide formation, sleek and silver, moving with a grace that made our own aircraft look clumsy by comparison. Soldiers disembarked in armored suits that shimmered faintly, some kind of shielding technology wrapped around each of them like a second skin. They moved in perfect lines, weapons raised, scanning the empty roads and quiet houses with the confidence of a species that had done this 100 times before on 100 other worlds. They found no army waiting for them, no tanks, no fighter jets rising to meet them, just an evacuated town, streets empty, doors left open, as if the people had simply stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. I watched through a pair of field glasses as their commander, a tall figure in dark ceremonial plating, walked to the center of the town square and spoke into a device at his wrist. I could not hear the words, but I imagined they were something like satisfaction, something like relief that this world would be as easy as their reports had promised. Then the ground opened, not with fire, not at first, simply openings, hidden hatches disguised as manhole covers, as storm drains, as ordinary patches of sidewalk that had been reinforced and prepared long before any of us knew an invasion was coming. From those openings came people, ordinary-looking people in reinforced gear, carrying weapons that did not look advanced at all, weapons that looked, if anything, almost old-fashioned compared to alien technology. The Kael'th soldiers reacted instantly, trained reflexes bringing their own weapons to bear. And here is the strange thing I will never forget. The humans did not run. They did not hesitate the way frightened, disorganized people are supposed to hesitate. They moved with a discipline that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training, something almost instinctive, communicating with hand signals and short bursts of speech, covering each other, falling back in patterns that made no sense to an enemy expecting chaos. I later learned the woman leading that unit was named Grace Whitfield, a former field researcher who had spent a decade studying human physiology under extreme stress before the Dominion ever arrived. She was not a soldier by trade. None of the people fighting that day were career military. They were teachers, engineers, farmers, people who had trained in secret for exactly this moment, for years, without ever knowing if the day would come. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted less than 20 minutes. The Kael'th soldiers were pushed back from the town square, forced to retreat toward their landing craft, several of their advanced shields failing under sustained and coordinated pressure that should not have worked against technology so far beyond our own. What confused them most, I heard later from an intercepted transmission Grant shared with a small circle of us afterward, was not the resistance itself. It was the recovery. Kael'th soldiers who took injuries that should have ended a fight retreated calmly, reorganized, and returned within minutes. Human units that lost members did not fall into panic or despair. They adjusted, filled gaps, and kept moving forward as though loss itself was simply another variable to work around. The Dominion commander withdrew his forces from Denver entirely by nightfall, reporting the operation as inconclusive, a word that meant far more than it seemed to on paper. Grant showed me the transcript 2 days later, translated from the alien tongue into careful English by a linguist who had been preparing for this exact task for longer than I had been flying fighters. "They keep calling it an anomaly," Grant said, tapping the page. "Look here. Human units display unusual continuation of combat effectiveness following losses exceeding 30%. Comparable species in Dominion records typically surrender at losses above 12%. "What does that mean?" I asked. Grant looked at me, tired but steady. "It means they built their entire strategy on the assumption that we would break easily. Every species they have ever encountered breaks somewhere, a point where the cost outweighs the will to continue. They are starting to realize we do not have that point in the way they expect." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about history classes I had barely paid attention to in school, wars that stretched on for years past the point any reasonable calculation said they should have ended, people who kept building, kept planting crops, kept raising children through famines and disasters that should have ended entire civilizations. I had never thought of it as strange before. It was simply what people did. Now I understood that somewhere out among the stars, an alien intelligence had studied 100 other worlds, and none of them had produced anything quite like it. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern repeated across the planet. In every region the Dominion attempted to secure, They met the same resistance. Not overwhelming firepower, not superior technology, something harder to categorize, a stubborn, adaptive persistence that turned every calculated Dominion advantage into an uncertain gamble. In the Amazon, a small team led by a mechanic named Henry Blake destroyed 3 armored transports using nothing more than modified mining equipment and an intimate knowledge of terrain the invaders had never bothered to properly map. In Northern Europe, coordinated power outages plunged Dominion communication networks into confusion for nearly 6 hours, long enough for evacuation of an entire coastal region that the aliens had assumed would be an easy target. In the Pacific, fishing vessels equipped with hidden equipment tracked and disrupted alien supply lines with a patience that seemed almost cruel in its precision. None of it was flashy. None of it looked like the kind of overwhelming victory people might imagine when they picture humanity standing up to an alien invasion. It was slower than that, and stranger. It was 1,000 small refusals to give up, stacking on top of each other until the Dominion's confident timeline for conquest began to unravel. I was finally reassigned to active flight duty during the 3rd week, escorting a convoy moving through what remained of a contested corridor in the Midwest. From the cockpit, I watched columns of smoke rising from both sides, our positions and theirs, and for the first time I understood that this war would not be won quickly by either side. It would be won by whoever could keep going the longest. That thought should have frightened me. Instead, strangely, it gave me something like comfort. I did not know yet what Grant and the others had been preparing all those years before the Dominion arrived. I did not know about the facilities beneath cities I had lived in my whole life, the decades of quiet planning, the generations of scientists and soldiers who had treated the possibility of this exact war as an inevitability worth preparing for, no matter how unlikely it seemed. I only knew what I saw. I saw a species the Dominion's own records described as fractured and weak, absorbing blow after blow and refusing to fall. I saw alien commanders, according to intercepted reports, requesting reinforcements they had never expected to need, revising timelines that had once promised total conquest within a single month. On the 22nd day of the invasion, Grant called me into a briefing room I had never been permitted to enter before. Inside were faces I recognized from years of service, and faces I had never seen, men and women introduced only by first names, their true roles left carefully vague. "Ethan," Grant said, gesturing for me to sit. "It is time you understood what you have actually been part of since the day you enlisted. I did not know it then, but that meeting would change everything I believed about my own species, about the history I had been taught, and about exactly what the Kael'th Dominion had truly declared war upon when they set their sights on a small, quiet, unremarkable planet called Earth." The room was quiet when Grant closed the door. Grace Whitfield was there too, her uniform still dusty from the field, sitting across the table with a folder in front of her that looked old, worn at the edges, as if it had been handled by many hands over many years. "What I am about to tell you," Grant said, "was classified before you were born. It stayed classified through 3 governments and 2 attempts to shut the whole program down. You are hearing it now because the war has made secrecy pointless." Grace slid the folder toward me. Inside were pages of research, dated back further than I expected, some of it written in a style of English that felt formal and old, the kind of language used in documents from the middle of the last century. "In the 1950s, Grace said, a small group of scientists and military planners became convinced that contact with another intelligent species was not a question of if, but when. Most of their peers thought they were foolish, wasting resources on a threat that might never arrive. They were allowed to continue anyway, quietly, buried inside larger budgets where nobody would notice a research program that never seemed to produce anything the public could see." "What were they researching?" I asked. "Us," Grant said simply. "What makes a human being keep going when every rational calculation says to stop?" Grace opened the folder to a page filled with charts and figures I did not fully understand, curves that rose and fell across decades of data. Every species that has ever evolved on this planet has faced extinction more than once, she said. Ice ages, meteor strikes, diseases that wiped out entire populations. Most species either adapted quickly or vanished. Human beings did something different. We adapted slowly, painfully, across hundreds of thousands of years, through conditions that should have ended us a dozen times over. We are not the strongest species that ever lived on this world. We are not the fastest or the toughest in any single measurable way, but we never stopped, even when stopping would have been the reasonable choice. I thought about the aliens in Denver, retreating not because we had beaten them decisively, but because they could not calculate an endpoint to our resistance the way their models expected. The program that folder describes, Grant continued, spent 70 years studying exactly that trait. Not to create better soldiers, to understand what it actually was, biologically and psychologically, so that if this day ever came, humanity would not be caught off guard the way our leaders originally were when they first considered the possibility. The tunnels beneath the base, the equipment I saw in Denver, Grace's team, none of that happened overnight. No, Grace said. It took generations. Every decade, small pieces were added, training programs disguised as civilian initiatives, manufacturing facilities hidden inside ordinary industrial complexes, entire communities built around research into human endurance, decision-making under extreme pressure, and cooperative behavior in group survival situations. Most of the people involved never knew the full picture. They only knew their small piece, and trusted that the rest fit together somewhere above their level of clearance. I sat back, trying to absorb what I was hearing. An entire hidden infrastructure, built across decades, resting quietly beneath the world I thought I knew, waiting for a war that most people alive had never believed would actually come. Why tell me now? I asked. Why not before I enlisted? Grant's expression softened slightly. Because knowledge like this changes people, Ethan. It can make some reckless, thinking themselves invulnerable. It can make others too cautious, waiting for a plan that was never meant to guarantee an easy victory, only a fighting chance. We needed pilots who flew because they believed in the mission in front of them, not because they were counting on a secret weapon to save them. Now that the war is real, and you have seen what our people are capable of with your own eyes, you deserve to understand why. Grace turned another page in the folder. This one contained a map, dotted with locations across every continent, small symbols marking facilities I had never heard mentioned in any news report or history lesson. There is something else you should understand, she said. The Dominion's intelligence on us was not wrong because they were careless. It was wrong because we made certain it would be. Every broadcast they intercepted, every historical record they studied, every war they analyzed was filtered through decades of careful management. Public conflicts were allowed to appear as chaotic and fractured as they truly were. Meanwhile, the deeper cooperative structures, the true capabilities being developed in secret, were kept completely separate from anything an outside observer could access. You mean we let them think we were weaker than we are, I said. We let them see exactly what our own history already showed them, Grant corrected. Human conflict has always looked disorganized from the outside. Nations arguing, alliances shifting, wars fought over borders and ideologies that seem petty compared to the scale of interstellar concerns. What the Dominion failed to understand is that beneath all of that surface disorder, there has always been a deeper thread of cooperation that emerges precisely when the stakes become large enough. They studied our history of division. They never accounted for what happens when every human being on the planet faces the same undeniable threat at the same time. I thought back to something my grandfather used to say, a man who had lived through hardships I only knew from stories, floods and shortages and years he rarely spoke about in detail. He always said that people were at their worst when things were easy, and at their best when things were hard. I had always assumed it was simply an old man's way of finding comfort in difficult memories. Now I wondered if he had understood something the Dominion's analysts had completely missed. There's more, Grace said, and something in her voice told me the most important part was still coming. The reason human beings recover from losses that would break other species is not simply about willpower. It is biological. Our stress response evolved under conditions of chronic, repeated hardship, not sudden catastrophic collapse, where many species evolve to either fight briefly and decisively or flee entirely. We evolved to endure long, difficult struggles across years and even generations, adjusting our behavior gradually rather than breaking suddenly. It is why human communities have historically rebuilt after disasters that erased entire other populations. It is not that we feel less pain or fear less. It is that our bodies and minds are built to keep functioning through prolonged difficulty in a way most other species never needed to develop. Grant leaned forward. The Dominion has encountered a dozen other spacefaring civilizations in their history, according to what our intelligence teams have gathered. Every one of them, when pushed past a certain threshold of loss, either surrendered or collapsed into disorder that made them easy to control. Their models assume every intelligent species works this way, because in their experience, every species they have met so far has. But we don't, I said. We never have, Grant replied. Read any account of human history during genuinely difficult periods, and you will find the same pattern repeating. People do not simply give up when things become hard. They adapt, they organize, and eventually, they push back harder than anyone expected. The Dominion built their invasion plan on the assumption that a fractured, quarrelsome species like ours would fracture further under pressure. Instead, they are discovering that pressure is the one condition under which humanity has always, throughout its entire existence, become more unified rather than less. I sat quietly for a while, letting all of it settle. The war outside these walls suddenly felt different to me, less like a desperate defense, and more like the activation of something that had always been present, waiting patiently beneath the surface of ordinary life. What happens now? I asked. If they know their models are wrong, won't they adjust their strategy? They will try, Grant said, and that is exactly what we are counting on. Grace closed the folder and looked at me directly. The next phase of this war is not about defending our cities anymore, Ethan. We have already shown them that direct invasion does not work the way their reports promised. Now they will attempt something more calculated. They will try to isolate our infrastructure, cut off communication between regions, attempt to divide us the way our own history suggested we could be divided. What they do not yet understand is that the very infrastructure they hope to target has already been decentralized, hidden, and prepared for exactly this kind of response for decades. You already know what they will do, I said. We know what every previous conquest in their historical record looked like, Grant said. Species that resist initial contact are typically isolated, starved of resources, and picked apart region by region until resistance becomes impossible to sustain. It has worked for them every time before, because every previous species eventually reached a breaking point when cut off from support long enough. And us? Grant allowed himself the smallest, tired smile. We built our resistance assuming isolation from the very beginning. Every facility you saw in Denver, every hidden network across this planet, was designed to function independently, without central coordination, without relying on supply lines that could be cut. We did not build one large defense that could be destroyed in a single blow. We built thousands of small, self-sufficient efforts that could continue fighting even if every other one of them fell silent. I understood then, more clearly than I had at any point since the invasion began, what Grant had meant that first night on the tarmac, when he told me this was not a war for pilots alone. This was a war being fought by an entire species that had, without most of its own citizens ever realizing it, spent generations quietly preparing for exactly this moment. There is one more thing, Grace said, her voice quieter now. The Dominion still does not understand the true scale of what they are facing. Their reports describe us as primitive but resourceful. They believe our resistance, however unexpected, still operates within limits similar to species they have conquered before. They do not yet know about the full extent of what has been prepared. They do not know how many decades of planning stand behind what they have seen so far. When they finally do understand, Ethan, I believe it will be the single greatest strategic shock in the recorded history of their entire civilization. I left that briefing room a different person than I had entered it. The tarmac outside looked the same as it always had, quiet under a sky that no longer felt entirely alien or entirely safe, but somehow, for the first time since the ultimatum arrived, it felt like a sky we had a real chance of keeping. Above us, somewhere among the stars, the Kael'th Dominion was recalculating everything they believed they knew about the small, quiet planet they had been so certain would be an easy conquest. They were about to learn exactly how wrong 70 years of careful, patient preparation could make their most confident assumptions. 6 weeks into the war, the Dominion changed their strategy exactly as Grant had predicted. They stopped attempting large-scale landings in populated regions and instead began targeting power stations, communication towers, and transportation routes, hoping to isolate our cities from one another the way they had isolated resistance on other worlds. I was assigned to a new unit by then, flying reconnaissance alongside a young pilot named Nathan Price, a quiet man from the coast who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. We spent most of our days tracking Dominion supply movements, feeding coordinates back to teams on the ground who struck with precision that still amazed me every time I watched it unfold. The truth Grant and Grace had shared with me changed the way I saw everything happening around me. What had once looked like scattered, desperate resistance now revealed itself as something closer to a vast, patient machine, thousands of independent pieces moving in coordination without ever needing a single central command to survive. When Dominion forces cut communication to one region, that region simply continued operating on plans prepared decades earlier, adjusting locally without needing instructions from anywhere else. "They keep trying to find our center," Nathan said one evening, as we reviewed intercepted Dominion communications translated by the linguistics team. "Every strategy they use assumes there is a single point they can destroy to end our resistance. A capital, a command center, a leader whose loss would break our will to continue. There isn't one," I said. "That's what is breaking them," Nathan replied. "Listen to this." He played a recording, alien words rendered into calm, careful English by the translation software. "Target region designated for isolation shows continued organized resistance despite total communication blackout exceeding 72 hours. Recommend reassessment of assumption that human coordination requires centralized command structure." I thought about that recording often in the weeks that followed. The Dominion had encountered other civilizations before, civilizations that fell into disorder the moment their leadership was removed, or their communication severed. They had never encountered a species that had spent generations deliberately preparing to function without any of those things, precisely because our own history had taught us that centralized power could always be threatened, always be destroyed, and that survival sometimes depended on never depending on a single point of failure. The turning point of the war, the moment I still think about most clearly, came nearly 3 months after the ultimatum first arrived. Grace's team, working with engineers who had spent years studying recovered Dominion equipment from earlier skirmishes, discovered a weakness in the shielding technology that had made their soldiers and vehicles so difficult to damage. It was not a flaw in the technology itself, but in how it responded to certain frequencies, a limitation the Dominion had never needed to address because no species they had fought before possessed the patience or the resources to study captured enemy equipment so thoroughly before using it against them. Grant called it Operation Quiet Tide, and I flew as part of the escort formation when it launched. The plan was simple in concept, though it had taken months of preparation to make possible. Coordinated teams across 6 continents would strike simultaneously at Dominion command vessels stationed above major cities, using modified equipment built specifically to exploit the shielding weakness Grace's team had discovered. The goal was not to destroy the Dominion fleet outright. It was to disable their command and communication capability all at once, across the entire planet, before they could adapt or reinforce. I remember the night sky lighting up in patterns I had never seen before. coordinated flashes appearing almost simultaneously across different time zones as reports came in from teams thousands of miles apart. Above Denver, the command vessel that had overseen the failed invasion months earlier suddenly went dark, its shields failing entirely, forcing an emergency withdrawal that left an entire sector of Dominion forces without central coordination for nearly 18 hours. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dominion units across the planet, accustomed to constant guidance from command vessels, suddenly found themselves operating independently for the first time since the invasion began. Unlike human forces, who had trained for decades to function without centralized support, Dominion soldiers hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without instructions from above. Intercepted communications from that period revealed a growing sense of alarm within Dominion leadership. One transmission, translated and shared with our unit during a debrief, stayed with me long after that night ended. Human forces demonstrate coordinated strategic capability inconsistent with pre-invasion intelligence assessments. Recommend immediate reassessment of overall conquest timeline. Possibility exists that observed resistance represents prepared response rather than improvised defense. They were beginning to understand, but understanding came too slowly to change their course. 2 weeks after Operation Quiet Tide, Dominion forces attempted a large-scale counterattack, concentrating their remaining strength against a coalition of resistance groups operating across Central Europe. It was the largest single engagement of the war, and I flew 3 missions that day, escorting supply convoys through contested airspace while ground forces held positions that seemed impossible to hold. What struck me most, watching from above, was not the scale of the fighting itself, but the calm with which our forces adapted to setbacks that would have ended the engagement for almost any other defender. When one position fell, another group simply absorbed the retreating forces and continued the fight from new ground. When communication with a unit was lost, nearby teams adjusted their own strategy automatically, filling gaps without waiting for instructions that might never arrive. By nightfall, Dominion forces had suffered losses far beyond anything their own historical records considered acceptable for a single engagement, and yet resistance forces on the ground had not broken, had not scattered, had simply continued fighting with the same steady persistence that had defined every encounter since the war began. Grant met me at the base that evening, exhaustion clear on his face, but something else there too, something that looked almost like quiet satisfaction. "They requested a temporary ceasefire an hour ago," he said. I stared at him, unsure I had heard correctly. "A ceasefire." "Not a surrender," Grant said. "Not yet. But their command structure is fracturing faster than they expected, and their models for predicting our behavior have failed at every single stage of this war. They are beginning to understand that they are not fighting a fractured, primitive species that will eventually break under pressure. They are fighting the one trait that has allowed us to survive every disaster this planet has ever thrown at us, activated now on a global scale for the very first time." I thought about the 4 words spoken on that first night, the ones that had ended the countdown before the invasion truly began. "This is Earth. Your survey was incomplete." I understood now exactly how incomplete that survey had been. The Dominion had studied our wars, our conflicts, our history of division, and concluded that humanity was a species defined by its fractures. What they had failed to understand, what no outside observer could have understood without living through it themselves, was that those very fractures had forged something underneath them, a persistence that only grew stronger the longer and harder the struggle became. They had declared war, expecting an easy conquest against a fragile, quarrelsome species. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that treated every setback as simply another problem to solve, every loss as information to learn from, and every attempt at isolation as an opportunity to prove that no single point of failure could ever bring an end to the resistance of an entire world working together for the first time in its long, difficult history. As I stood on that tarmac, watching reports come in of Dominion forces requesting terms across multiple fronts simultaneously, I finally understood what Grant had meant on that very first night, when he told me this was not a war for pilots alone. It had never been a war we needed to win through overwhelming force. It was a war we had always been quietly, patiently prepared to outlast. The formal end of the war came 4 months after it began, in a room I never expected to stand in, surrounded by people whose names I had only read in classified files until that day. Dominion representatives arrived under a flag of parley, a small delegation landing at a neutral site in Geneva that had been prepared for exactly this possibility. I was there as part of the honor escort, standing near the back of the room, close enough to watch history happen without being close enough to shape it myself. The Dominion negotiator was a tall figure named Vel Ashari, dressed in formal robes that carried none of the confident authority I remembered from that first ultimatum months earlier. His voice, translated into calm English, carried something I had never expected to hear from a species that had arrived promising easy conquest. "We came here believing this world would submit," he said, addressing the small group of human representatives seated across from him. "Our records showed a species divided against itself, incapable of sustained resistance beyond the limits every other civilization we have encountered eventually reached. We were wrong, and the cost of that error has been significant on both sides." Grace Whitfield sat among the human delegation, her research finally acknowledged openly rather than buried in classified files. Grant stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching quietly the way he always did when he wanted to understand a situation fully before speaking. The human representative leading the negotiation was a woman named Alice Bennett, formerly a diplomat with decades of experience in conflicts most people had never heard about, chosen specifically for this moment because she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, how to translate quiet strength into terms an outside power could respect. "Your reports were not entirely wrong," Alice said. "Our history is filled with division, with conflict, with disagreements that have cost us dearly across thousands of years. What your reports failed to account for is what happens to a species that has survived ice ages, plagues, and catastrophes that erased entire other populations from this world. We do not fracture under pressure. We have simply never needed to prove that to anyone beyond our own planet until now." Vel Ashari was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Our historical records include no precedent for a species capable of both such profound internal conflict and such complete unification when faced with an external threat. We did not believe such a combination was possible. We understand now that it is not only possible, but may be the very trait that has allowed your species to survive as long as it has." The terms of the peace that followed were not simple, and I will not pretend the cost of reaching them had been small. Cities across the planet still carried the scars of that war. Families across every continent had lost people who would never come home, and no treaty, however carefully worded, could undo that loss. I think of Nathan Price often, who did not return from the final engagement over Central Europe, and of the quiet way he used to speak only when he had something worth saying. I think of the ground crews, the researchers, the ordinary people who had spent decades of their lives preparing for a war they hoped would never come, and who gave everything they had when it finally did. But the terms themselves reflected something important, something that went beyond simple victory or defeat. Earth did not demand conquest of the Dominion in return. We did not seek to expand beyond our own solar system, or to punish a civilization that had underestimated us so completely. What Alice Bennett and the human delegation demanded instead was recognition, clear and permanent, that this world would never again be treated as an easy target, that any future contact between Earth and any other civilization among the stars would begin with the understanding that humanity, however fractured it might appear on the surface, could never be assumed weak simply because its history looked complicated from a distance. The Dominion agreed, and word of the treaty, we later learned, spread quickly among the other spacefaring civilizations they had contact with, civilizations who had watched the outcome of this war with an interest the Dominion had not expected. I remember standing outside that building in Geneva after the treaty was signed, looking up at a sky that finally felt like it belonged to us again. Grant found me there, the way he always seemed to find me at the important moments, standing quietly beside me without saying anything for a while. "You did well, Ethan," he said eventually. "I mostly just flew reconnaissance," I said. "I didn't do what Grace's team did, or what the ground forces did. I don't feel like someone who changed the outcome of a war." Grant smiled, tired but genuine. "That's exactly the point, isn't it? This was never about one person changing the outcome. It was about millions of people, each doing their own small part, none of them individually deciding the ending, all of them together making an ending like this possible." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about the decades of quiet preparation that had come before I was even born, the researchers who spent careers building something they hoped would never be needed, the ground crews and pilots and ordinary citizens across the planet who had simply kept going, day after day, refusing to give the Dominion the easy conquest their reports had promised them. I thought about Grace's explanation of human endurance, the biological and psychological traits shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of surviving conditions that had erased so many other species from the world. I thought about how strange it was that the very history the Dominion had studied to conclude we were weak, our wars, our disasters, our long difficult struggles across generations, was the exact same history that had built the resilience which ultimately defeated their entire strategy. In the months that followed, life slowly began returning to something resembling normal, though nothing would ever feel entirely the same again. I returned to flying, though the missions were different now, quieter, focused on rebuilding rather than defending. Grace continued her research, no longer hidden away in classified facilities, but working openly, studying not just how humanity had endured this war, but how we might continue growing stronger from what we had learned about ourselves. Grant retired quietly a year later, though I still visited him occasionally at a small house outside the city, where he spent his days doing nothing more dramatic than tending a garden that seemed to bring him more peace than I had ever seen him carry during the war. "Do you ever think they'll come back?" I asked him once, sitting on his porch as the sun went down over quiet hills that had once echoed with the sound of alien engines. Grant considered the question carefully before answering, the way he always did. "Maybe," he said, "maybe someone else will, someday. Species out among those stars who look at a small, quiet world and decide it must be an easy target because its history looks complicated from a distance. I hope, if that day ever comes, that whoever is standing where you once stood remembers what we learned, that being complicated is not the same as being weak. That struggle is not the same as fracture, that a species capable of surviving everything this world has ever thrown at it will always find a way to keep going, long after anyone watching from the outside expects it to stop." I have thought about those words often since that evening. I think about them now, writing this account down so that whoever reads it someday will understand exactly what happened during those difficult months, and exactly why an ancient, patient civilization arrived at our small, quiet planet so utterly certain of an easy victory. They studied our history, our conflicts, our long record of division, and they concluded, reasonably enough given everything they had ever encountered before, that Earth would be simple to conquer. They never accounted for the truth hidden beneath that complicated history. They never understood that a species shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of enduring famine, disaster, and hardship that erased so many other forms of life from this world would never simply lie down when the greatest challenge in its long history finally arrived. They declared war on Earth, confident and certain, expecting a species too fractured to resist. They never realized, until it was far too late, that nothing which has ever truly threatened humanity's survival on this world has ever managed to end it, and that we had simply been waiting, quietly and patiently, for the day something from beyond our own sky would finally understand exactly what that meant.